President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has reasserted his rule in Turkey with Sunday's clear election victory for his Islamist-rooted AKP. What does this mean for Turkey and for the country's Western allies at a time of continuing war in neighbouring Syria and broader regional instability? Joining me to discuss these questions is Dan Dombey, until recently the FT's correspondent in Turkey. Dan, there's been quite a lot of concern, particularly amongst Turkey's allies in recent months about the situation there. Has this election resolved the situation?
This election is that word which is often used about elections vainly, but I think in this case correctly, historic. It's a tremendously important election about the course on which Turkey's embarked. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has with this election confirmed his status as the most powerful leader of his country since its founder, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. And he's done so against an astonishingly disturbing backdrop. In the last few months, since inconclusive elections in June, we've seen a resurgence in very violent fighting between the government and Kurdish militants. We've seen Turkey's worst ever terrorist attack, almost certainly perpetrated by ISIS. We've seen very worrying signs of ethnic and sectarian strife. And we've also seen an increasing clampdown on the media, which days before the election culminated on a tear gas attack on an opposition outlet that immediately became pro-government. There's absolutely no doubt that Turkey was in turmoil. Mr. Erdogan used this election, that as his argument in this election, saying that only he could provide the stability that Turkey needed. His critics said that he stoked that instability. And so now the big question is, will the instability deepen? Will the sectarian and ethnic tensions that have been sharpened grow worse? Will the battle in the southeast, the fight with ISIS, get worse? Or will Mr. Erdogan, now that he has this unparalleled power in Turkey's recent history, move to resolve these issues? That's the big question. To date, in the past, when he's won big elections, he's sometimes taken a more conciliatory approach. Does he feel he needs to, now that his position is so unassailable?
Well, that's a very clear summary of where we are. The markets this morning have reacted pretty positively. The stock market in Istanbul is up sharply, the Turkish lira has strengthened. Are we going to see some stabilisation of the economy? Is this election, from an investor's point of view, good news in economic and financial terms?
That's exactly right. The Turkish markets have been some of the worst behaving among the emerging markets, which is a pretty troubled asset class, as you know, this year. That's been because of concerns about a possible US Fed rate rise, concerns about high level of corporate debt in foreign currency in Turkey, about political instability, and about arbitrary government. The rally that we've seen today reflects that the political instability is over. A whole period of political turbulence that probably started with the big anti-government protests in May, June 2013 has now ended. We're not going to see any more elections till 2019 unless there's something very surprising happening in Turkey. That's a big plus. But the big question mark is, what kind of government are we going to see? Mr. Ahmet Davutoglu, the Prime Minister, has been very clear that he wants to see structural reform. He wants to see issues to improve the rather poor savings rate, to increase the tax base, to really create higher value-added goods in Turkey. Erdogan doesn't seem so convinced. He's a big champion of the construction sector. He's very quick to label businessmen who don't agree with him as traitors. In fact, he even used that term of the current central bank governor. Whether he now feels that he can go ahead with populist, construction-oriented policies, or whether Turkey is going to have a more technocratic bent of government, is again going to be the big thing that decides whether this is going to be a very vulnerable asset class if US interest rates do indeed rise, or actually one that has suffered a big fall and now can rebound.
Stabilising the economy is obviously important for Turkey's allies as well, but the really big question probably right now is Syria. What can Turkey's Western allies now hope for from President Erdogan after this election result in terms of the situation in Syria?
I think this is the big question. You have to divide, however, the EU and the US. For the EU, the big issue is refugees. As someone who lived in Turkey until relatively recently, I can say that despite all the wailing and gnashing of teeth about refugees in Western Europe, that is as nothing compared to Turkey. In Turkey, we see indigent Syrians on every street corner of every city, and that is no exaggeration. The EU has been desperate to get Mr. Erdogan to do more to keep these people in Turkey. I'm not so clear that it's within his power. For the US, the battle is with ISIS, and that's what's most important. After the worst ever terrorist atrocity in Turkish history, Mr. Erdogan and his government essentially blamed the Kurds, not ISIS, despite all the evidence to the contrary. The real still doubt about whether Turkey's tolerating a presence of ISIS that other countries would have done more to combat. And there's a real fundamental irritant right now. The US, because of its own failed attempts to train foreign fighters within Syria, is doing more all the time to help Kurdish militants within Syria to fight ISIS. The Turks see those Kurds as its enemy. This is a tension point that could grow in coming days. Neither side, with this election result, is likely to back down.
Dan Dombey, thank you very much indeed.